Hi, Aiden.
All right. Hey, so we're having some extra conversations around this conflict series because there's kind of the theology, the practice, the scripture of it, but there's a lot of questions that we have. But what about, how does this play out? What do you think of this? Because conflict is everywhere. I want to start with this. You talked about this week, and I think you do this in premarital a lot. I remember you doing it with my wife and I 10 years ago. We talked about skunks and turtles. You know, turtles during conflict like to pull away, hide away inside. Skunks make a big stink about stuff. If Jen was here, your wife, would she say you're a skunk or a turtle? Are you turtley or skunky?
One, I can't believe you've been married 10 years. And you got to answer the question, too, after I do.
I think you could answer the question for me.
When my wife and I first got married, honestly, we were terrible at resolving conflict.
Yeah.
And that's an easy answer for me. I would say I'm much more on the skunk end of things. And I'm much more type A.
Yeah.
I was competitive as a kid, so, when you get in a conflict, it's all about winning,
Yeah.
Yeah. And when we got married, I'm like, I just took that into marriage. Like, it's about winning, right? And my wife, what made it hard, that was not her bent.
Yeah.
And it really got us all confuzzled when it came to conflict because, I almost would litigate it like a lawyer. This, and she'd be like, whoop, and that would make me madder. So, but I do think those two extremes, somewhere in between, there's variations, but skunks and turtles happen. But if Jen was here, she'd definitely say that. Yeah. How about, what would Sarah say?
I think sometimes our relationship kind of depends. So in our marriage, she's definitely a turtle, I'm definitely a skunk.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I just get annoying. With things, I'm like, I'll just be very, you talked about the inner 2-year-old. She's like, yeah, dude. He's one of those. And she can kind of bloop, But in other relationships, depending I don't know, around here, I'm probably more turtley. You know what I mean? It's probably I don't know, sometimes the dynamic of relationships, you know what I mean? I don't know if it's, I think sometimes the relationship can dictate how we respond in certain ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree with you.
Yeah.
You so you're a chameleon. You kind of change based on the
more of an octopus. They can adapt to their surroundings and things like that. But one of the things. So this first week was a lot of introspection, right? Look at this James passage. What causes fights and quarrels? And he's like, it's not the situation. It's not the heat of the argument. He's like, what's inside of you, right? And so I spent a lot of this week looking at the inner 2-year-old, the 2-timer, inside of us. What makes that so hard for us to be honest with ourselves? Because in any conflict, if Sarah and I in our argument, if I'm frustrated with something at work, if I have a difference of opinion with a friend on maybe an issue or whatever, it's so easy to just turn and be like, yeah, but they shouldn't, and I don't ever get to, and you just kind of play the story. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to turn that back on ourselves. What makes that so hard for us? Would you say?
Oh, man, I so many things come to my mind. I think we come hardwired with this need to validate ourselves. And so when there's conflict, I feel like somehow you're invalidating something in me.
Yeah.
And so my knee-jerk reaction is to defend, to validate, to justify, to prove a point, to be right. And sometimes I am right. Let's just be honest. Sometimes in a conflict, you might be right.
Yeah.
But the impulse is to do that, and no conflict gets resolved and relationships get shattered. I think the reason, I'd love to hear you interact with this too, son, but I think in my own life, and then even in what I get a chance to do, I think we're scared to death of what we'll find. It's not the natural instinct.
Yeah. Yeah.
My natural instinct is to validate myself, which is why the gospel is so powerful, because I'm not validated by what I do. I'm validated because of what he did.
Yeah.
Right? And so then I can resolve conflict from who I am, not in order to be somebody. Sometimes I have to prove a point because I got to come out of it looking a certain way.
Yeah.
The gospel says this. And so I can come into it with the validation of being a child of God, forgiven, right? There's a security anchored in the hope of Christ. I'm not looking for validation. So I'm not like, I don't have to do this. But I think we're also afraid.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is, I'll speak for me, there's scary stuff that's in there. Like in all of us. You're like, wow, okay, I'm selfish. It's easy. We can just say that tritely. I'm selfish.
Yeah.
When you really go in the deep confines of the cave of your soul, you're like, I'm more selfish than I thought. I don't really want to know how selfish I am or how you fill in the blank. So I think we need to validate, and I think we're afraid because there's things in there. I mean, what would you think? Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I agree with all that. And whether you're someone who likes conflict, if you're more of a skunk, you might bend more towards that, just like, it feels so good to be right. Mm-hmm. And for them to be like, okay, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. You're like, yeah, you are. Like, that feels... And on the other end, like the turtle side, like sometimes it feels better just to get it over with. Mm-hmm. And just to like, and all of that are things inside of us, whether I want to win or I want to avoid. It's a selfish desire just to, for the turtle, like, navigating through this is not worth the price. So I would rather just stay comfortable. I think what makes it hard too sometimes is the self-awareness piece. Like, I was actually just thinking about this morning. I only know what I know about myself. Mm-hmm. Like once Sarah said to me once, she's like, in conversation you yawn every time you feel like there's an awkward silence. I was like, I do not. And sure enough, I'm like, we're with somebody like, yeah, it's cool. And I'm like, oh no, I had no idea I did that. And so I think sometimes what makes it hard is I don't know where to look. Mm-hmm. So I know that I'm hitting a wall. I know that I don't like this feeling. I know that every time there's a conflict, I skunk, or every time there's a conflict, I avoid, or if I know a conflict's coming, I kind of hide around. But I don't always realize I'm doing that. So I think sometimes it's hard to be honest with ourselves because we don't know our blind spots. And I think that's almost inherently part of this whole conversation is in the conflict, there's like I don't do that. Mm-hmm. And so you're almost in the conflict coming to terms with a blind spot, a shadow piece of yourself that you are almost navigating the conflict with that person. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, sometimes being like, oh, you're right, I do like to win, or I am more prideful, or, oh, that is a thing that and you almost wrestle in both at the same time, maybe.
Yeah, I think something you said that's very interesting to me is, because whether you're the skunk or the turtle, that need for validation can trigger the reflex in you.
Yeah.
So if you're a turtle, you'd be like, well, I just kind of, but that need to validate myself can be the reason I go into that, right? I just want to get it past. I don't want to, because I don't want to look deep inside as to why that's my reflex.
Yeah.
Why is my reflex being a skunk? Well, some of it's personality, sure.
Yeah.
But some of it's just sinful, like gross stuff in there that, like, I need to be right.
Yeah.
I wish my brain was sharper, but you might remember the guy who said, Socrates, I think, is the one who said this.
Yeah.
It's
been a while since I've read
Plato, Socrates, right?
I get them all in Plato, Socrates.
I think he's the one that said this, that a dangerous life is the unexamined life. And I think of the guy that was interviewed for a paper, and they asked him, can you tell us what's wrong in the world? And he gave them a short answer. He said...
It was Chesterton.
It was Chesterton.
Yeah.
He said, what's wrong in the world is, he just wrote this, I am. And I think there's nothing natural about that.
Yeah.
We're not naturally bent to look humbly at ourselves to invite God to look in. Like, I think, what a powerful Psalm 139, I think it ends 23, 24, something like that. Like, search me, know me. Yeah. Think about the God of the universe, like, show me what you see. It's like, ooh.
Yeah.
And then you start inviting your wife and brothers and sisters in Christ to speak into your life, and they're like, something, you're kind of aggressive in the way you talk. I'm not aggressive. Like, well, you might be. I don't know.
You're just weak. Yeah. And that almost inherently feels like unnecessary. Like if there's a conflict, like, that pre-work, that's nice if you have time, but we need to get through this. It almost can feel like that's nice if you can get to it. Whereas that is the starting ground for all this.
Well, first of all, thank you, Sarah, for explaining why he yawns in so many of my meetings with him. But
that's not
the self-awareness part is interesting because in my relationship with my wife, when I had a guy speak into my life who made me aware that I could beat her in our arguments. Like, I just out-argue her.
Yeah.
And I can win the argument because she's going to give up. I'm more competitive. She'd care less about scoring the touchdown. I need to get the touchdown and the extra point, right? And that self-awareness for me, it opened up a whole new thing to me because I love my wife. And I'm like, I think he's right. Like when I started to look at this, and so all of a sudden what I justified in the past I looked at with a different pair of glasses.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that's just the way I am.
Yeah.
And you're gonna have to get on board with it.
Yeah.
Well, the way I am was totally running my, we were married just a couple of years, running her over.
Yeah.
And I'm like, she's pretty easy to out-argue,
Yeah.
And anyways, that self-awareness is freeing, actually. It's actually freeing.
Yeah, that is a huge cop-out that I think well, that's just how I am. That's just how I talk. That's just, I don't like to get in fights, so that's how. And it can be a big... And one of the things James says is everybody's favorite verse. I've seen lots of pillows and pictures with grieve, wash your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts. You're like, you read that, you're like, well, that's not very exciting. But we were kind of having a little bit of a conversation about almost that process, the necessity of washing your hands, purifying your hearts, grieving your sin. Why is that progression so important, and how does that kind of lead us to go deeper? Because it can be very easy, whether you're a skunk who just wants it over with and you're like, okay, hey, I'm sorry I yelled, or you're a turtle who just wants to get it over with and you're like, yeah, sorry. Why is that not enough? Why is not just the saying sorry, are we good? Why is stopping there not enough to actually heal conflict?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, I've never seen a wall hanging with that on, that's for sure, or a pillow. But I think there's a sobering verses, and I think they're very not palatable in our culture.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you know this as well as I. We live in a culture that makes sin the punchline. And we have all kinds of mantras, Mm-hmm. It's just the way I am, or boys will be boys, or you fill in the blank. There's all kinds of mantras that we just kind of, it's the punchline. It's the thing we laugh at. And I think what James is doing there, and I believe that the Bible inspired by God, so I think this is God's heart being reflected here, is he's saying that I certainly need to address the external, wash your hands.
Yeah. But
I think that's where we stop.
Yeah.
I hit you. I'm sorry I hit you.
Yeah.
And I think what he's saying is take that next step. It's like, I wonder why I hit you.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder why. Because if I don't go there, I might not hit you again, but the very same monster that drove me to hit you, very same dysfunction, sin, impurity in my heart will cause me to do something else. Mm-hmm. If I have an addiction, I meet with a lot of pastors, young pastors and wannabe pastors. If I have an addiction, maybe a sex addiction, I can say, hey, I'm going to clean that up. I'm going to get rid of the porn. I'm going to get rid of the whatever. And you're like, that's awesome. I'm going to wash my hands of it. But if I don't get under here and say, wonder what is driving that, the very same monster that drives that, which that's obviously, can drive an addiction in ministry to approval so that I'll do things simply so that you'll say how great my sermon was, how great my leadership was. Yeah. And so if I don't ever get there, I won't have healing. And so what I'll do is I'll go from creating conflict over here. I might not hit you anymore. Yeah. But somehow I'll find a way to, whether literally or figuratively, hit somebody over here because I still am dealing with this. Yeah. And it also, I think, is an indicator that I'm not allowing myself to see it the way God sees it. Because he doesn't just see what I did here. Yeah. I'm not going to hit you, I promise. But he doesn't just see that.
Wouldn't be the first time.
But what he sees is my heart. That's what I'm inviting him to see. And so that's what I think when I think about that. I think it's a sobering passage that's easy for us, it's not really a popular passage. I like the part where he gives us more grace. Let's stay there, Yeah. And it's like, and I do too. Yeah. I do too. Yeah. But I think that the pathway to that is us actually humbling ourselves in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's the wash your hands, almost the stop punching people, purify your hearts, why? And in there, that grieve, mourn, and wail, you're like, gosh, it feels very, dark, but almost that feeling the weight of our sin, which sometimes is hard to feel separate from seeing the damage done. You know what I mean? It can be hard, I think it's a big deal, but I don't feel like it is until you see the hurt in the other person. You're like, oh. and almost that dynamic of wash your hands, purify your hearts, grieve, mourn, and wail. And at that point, you're humbled. In that passage, God opposes the proud, but gives grace, favor to the humble. You're like, does he like humble people more than proud people? You're like, proud people don't need his grace. You're like, I won the fight, and I'm sorry. But if I'm like, oh man, I should have yelled at you. Why did I yell at you? I feel the weight of sin, and why? Then I'm brought low, and there's almost this opportunity for grace. But he gives more grace. I love how it ends with that. But I don't need that if I don't get there. And we so often, so quickly, I'm sorry, can I have the grace? And he's like, you got to go down in order to need that grace, or else you're right back in the same spot because I really didn't need it. There's something in that progression I think is powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I say this in the sermon, but let's just be honest. It is, what James is talking about is counterintuitive. It's not natural, and yet it's the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
It's what makes the family of God unique in the way we deal with conflict. I have been told in conflict, and I think it's good advice, take the high road. But what James is reminding us of, the high road is low.
Yeah.
It's low, not take the low road but it's like, it's humility, it's submission, and that's not natural.
Yeah.
It's more natural for me to do what James tells us not to do. It's more natural for me to put myself up and put you down.
Yeah.
That's more natural. It's more natural for me to justify myself by prosecuting you.
Yeah.
That's just more natural. I'd rather protect my name by smearing your name.
Yeah.
Like, that's because we're proud. And we all have a couple ounces of that in us. We fight it all the time, and I think it makes it hard. So I think that is so important. If you want to drink from the well of this more grace, which is fascinating in the passage. I don't know if we're going to get there, but he says we actually cheat on God. That the main conflict is the conflict we have with God. And so when we realize that, it's like, I want to be married to God and yet fool around on him. It's kind of what he says.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm uncomfortable by you saying
yeah. I mean, James is like right in our face. And so it's like, okay, bam, he hits us. But then he says, but you need to know that there's this God who jealously longs for us. Okay, and so that's interesting. He longs for this faithfulness and this devotion. And it's the next thing he says is he gives us more grace. And so I think if there's anything that inspires or motivates the way I resolve conflict, it's the way he decided to resolve it with us. And when I think about that, I'm like, it's humbling.
Yeah.
The very next thing he says is, that's why God opposes the proud. I can't receive that more grace and be proud.
Yeah.
Right? And so, I think it's just the passage is fascinating, chock full. We probably could spend a whole series on just James 4. Yeah.
Yeah, this is great to unpack this. The next couple weeks, we'll talk through some of those just like tangible things. Like, okay, but at what point do I stop trying? At what point do they not want? At what point do I? What does it look like when I don't feel that? So we want to navigate through some of those things as we keep going. But I appreciate you sharing with us today.
Oh man, this is fun, and I look forward to how God is going to use it. Right? Like, the fact of the matter is, I think it's surprising to people. They think, well, there's conflict in my marriage, there's conflict in the family, there's conflict at workspace, with my neighbor, in politics, but conflict can show up in the church.
Yeah. Oh.
Right? Because the church is full of those people, of which, by the way, you're one.
Well, I'm not.
I am too. And so he says, I want it to be unique. I just imagine, and then but what would happen if we actually did conflict differently and gave the world a different picture?
Yeah.
Where the beauty of Christ and the gospel showed up. So it's a fascinating conversation.
Love it.